Minnie watched her closely. "You got it bad, ain't you, honey? You better cut down on your blows, Terry, or you gonna end up with an oil burner." As she spoke, she removed a small pack of heroin and slipped it under the bag she had laid on the counter. The sight of the drug caused Terry to break wind loudly. She blushed, snatched up the small package, and hurried toward the restroom. She clutched at her stomach. The closer she got, the more compelling it seemed that she was about to have a bowel movement. Minnie watched her leave with concern. It would have looked better if Terry had waited until after she had left the counter. She waited until Terry disappeared from sight, then turned and made her way toward the refund counter, unaware that she'd been under surveillance ever since she entered the store. Terry found an empty stall in the restroom and went in. No sooner had she entered it than another woman came through the restroom door. The sound of someone washing her hands came to her, but Terry paid it no heed. She cursed silently. She had forgotten to stop and get her purse. Now she didn't have anything to make a quill with. It would have been too inconvenient to go back for the purse, so she just opened the tiny package and held it close to her nose and snorted. Doing it this way caused her to waste a small amount of the dope, but it didn't disturb her. The only thing that mattered was that she get most of it into her system. It didn't occur to her that the drug didn't make her high anymore unless she had a large amount of it. She just knew the drug made her feel normal again, and that was what she so desperately sought. The drug had become a temporary relief from the terrible desire that ate at her mind and body every day until it had been appeased. After the drug brought on its mellowing effect, Terry again thought about going to a doctor for help. But it was always this way after she had satisfied the nagging hunger of the habit. When she was sick, there was but one thought on her mind. Where could she get a fix? She had promised herself time and time again that she would seek out a doctor, but when she awoke in the morning craving a fix, the only thing she would seek would be the nearest dope house. Terry opened the door and stepped out. The woman standing at the faucet watched her in the mirror. Terry nodded her head in a form of greeting and walked over and looked in the mirror. The first thing she noticed was a small amount of white powder on the edge of her nose. With the back of her hand she removed it, and, telling herself the other woman wouldn't know what was happening, snorted it off her hand. Something in the back of her mind rang a bell. She tried to place the woman next to her. Suddenly, it dawned on her. The woman was one of the extra floor walkers the store hired to help keep down their loss of merchandise from shoplifters. She washed up quickly and left the woman in the restroom. After picking up the refund for the 2 sweaters, Minnie came back to Terry's department. She fingered some dresses as she waited for Terry to return. It had been a good day's hustling for both of them, she reasoned. Both sweaters had sold for over $39 separately. With the tax money added on, each sweater had brought over $40 on the refund. $80 wasn't a bad day's work, and with her stomach getting larger every day, she would have to find some other way of hustling other than whoring. She glanced around casually as she waited for Terry to come back and wait on her. The department store was one of the largest in Detroit. It carried a full supply of almost any kind of merchandise a woman could want. The departments on the upper floors carried furs and expensive jewelry, while the basement held a full range of furniture, from couches to wall-to-wall carpets. Under a cheap dress she had picked out, Minnie placed 3 Kimberly knit 2-piece outfits. She glanced around casually. There was no one shopping near them but 2 elderly women, so when Terry approached, she held the bundle out to her. Terry accepted the clothes and walked over towards her counter. She stopped at the cash register. After taking a brief glance around to satisfy her fear, she began to write up the order. Intentionally, she left out the 3 expensive Kimberly knits. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded up the dresses and put them all neatly into a white box. Casually, Minnie gave her a $10 bill. Terry took it, rang up the cash register, and gave Minnie a few dollars back as change. Minnie picked up the box and started walking slowly towards the door. As soon as she reached the exit, 2 women came up beside her and took her by the arms. "Just come with us quietly, dear," one of them said softly. From her dress counter farther back in the store, Terry watched the arrest going on. A stab of fear jolted her. It suddenly entered her mind that she might get arrested too. Before she could react, she saw her supervisor approaching in the company of 2 other women. "Terry, We would like to see you in the office. Please follow me." It was a request, but it had the sting of an order behind it. Mrs. Breeding waited until Terry came from behind her counter, then led the way towards her office as the other women dropped behind and brought up the rear. The other salesgirls standing at their counters watched the procession curiously. When they reached the office and stepped in, Minnie was already there, standing against the wall, looking as though the world had come to an end. Her head hung down, and she refused to meet the eyes of any of the women detectives in the room. A stout, heavy-faced woman was behind the desk, removing the knit dresses from the box. "Well, would you look at this? What in the world could these be?" she asked, with pretended innocence. Mrs. Breeding, the supervisor, stared at the dresses as though she couldn't believe her eyes. "When I was informed about this, Terry, I didn't believe it. I thought that a grievous error had been made. In fact, all the while we were walking toward this room, I was trying to figure out how I could apologize to you for bringing you here. But now, I'm just about shocked out of my senses." She sat down behind her desk in a daze. She picked up the clothes and felt them, as if trying to prove to herself it was not a bad dream. "This is utterly unbelievable," she murmured softly. "Why, I've known this child's parents for over 20 years. She has no reason in the world to steal." She spoke to the other women in the room, but actually, she was speaking to herself. "I don't know what to make of this. There's the evidence right before my eyes, yet I still don't want to accept it." She picked up the sales slip and slammed it back down on the desk. Her eyes fell on Minnie, leaning against the wall. "Now that," she said, pointing an angry finger in Minnie's direction, "that I wouldn't expect anything else out of. But you, Terry? This is disgraceful. What will your mother think? How will she feel? Did you ever give it a thought?" The questions came fast and hard. "Not even to mention the disgrace you brought upon yourself, Terry. That's nothing compared to the shock and hurt your parents will receive from this. Didn't you even consider that you could end up in jail for stealing?" Mrs. Breeding shook her abundance of graying hair and glared angrily at Terry. The door opened, and the woman who had been in the toilet with Terry came into the office. She walked straight over to Minnie and picked up one of her arms. The tracks running up and down the veins stood out in all their sinister implications. "This girl here is on some kind of drug, Mrs. Breeding. I believe it's heroin." She dropped Minnie's arm. "I don't know for sure, but when I went into the John, I think Terry was using some kind of drug also," she said coldly. Mrs. Breeding came out of her chair as though shot from a cannon. "Is that true, Terry? Have you been foolish enough to get yourself involved with some kind of addicts?" "No, ma'am," Terry answered in a timid voice. She had been high when she entered the room, but the fear of arrest was like a splash of cold water on her face. She searched frantically for a lie that would get her out of this trouble. If there was any hope of salvation, she had to find it. The very thought of having the store press charges against her for shoplifting was stupefying. If she would have to appear in court in front of all the people just like a common criminal, she would just die. The thought made her turn crimson. Mrs. Breeding, seeing her blush, thought that Terry was ashamed of just being accused of using drugs. There was no possible way, she thought angrily, that a nice girl like Terry could actually be on anything like dope. She couldn't bring herself to think about it, let alone believe Terry guilty of it. She called two of the women detectives over to her desk. They whispered quietly among themselves for a few minutes. Every once in a while, one of the women would shake her head vigorously. "Not the other one," Terry managed to hear as she leaned forward, trying to catch snatches of the conversation. Mrs. Breeding came around to the front of her desk and leaned against it. "Terry, because of your mother's honesty and goodness, I can't be the one to cause her a broken heart. She worked for me for over 20 years, so I owe her something more than heartache. Because of this, young lady, we're going to give you a break. You don't deserve it, but I'm doing it because of my deep respect for your mother." She paused for a moment, walked behind the desk, and opened a drawer. "Here," she snapped, taking out a check and tossing it on the desk. We've decided to keep this among ourselves. This is your last check, Terry. What you have coming next week, we will keep to pay for the articles you and your friends have stolen." She glared at Terry, hurt and bewilderment in her eyes. "If for any reason you're ever seen in this store, you will be arrested on sight, Terry. Now, if you don't like us keeping your other check, you can get ready to go to the nearest police station and take it up with the judge in the morning. It's your decision." Her voice had grown harsh. "Speak up now. What do you want to do? It doesn't make any difference to me.